Hello, I'm John Molesky. Welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My guests today are Rami Khouri. Rami is a former Wilson Public Policy Scholar with the Middle East Program. He now serves as American University of Beirut's Distinguished Public Policy Fellow and as an Arab Center Washington Senior Fellow. Also joining us is Guy Laron. Guy is a senior lecturer at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and is also a former Wilson Public Policy Fellow. He served time with the Wilson Center's Middle East Program, the Kennedy Institute, and the History and Public Policy Program. Gentlemen, great to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. So today we're going to be talking about the conflict between Israel and Hamas and how it has spread to other avenues. And I thought I would begin, gentlemen, with getting each of you to provide us with your general take on where we stand in terms of escalation versus de-escalation and how that relates to what seemingly now are dashed hopes for any soon ceasefire. Let's begin in the order of introduction, Rami, and let you have the first word.
Okay, thank you. I'm glad to be with you, and thanks for doing this. We are in an escalating situation on both the Israeli and the Palestinian side, which is actually the culmination of about 100 years of conflict. October 7 was a decisive moment when Hamas did its attack in Israel, and then Israel retaliated with its severe and ongoing war. But really, this is continuing a contest that started really a century ago, 1922, 1923, with the British League of Nations mandate and after the Balfour Declaration, as the Zionist movement, which was a very noble thing for Jews, turned into part of the British imperial project in the Middle East and moved with British assistance to create a Jewish state, which happened, Israel. It was inevitable that this conflict was going to continue. And it has, and has brought in other Arab countries and Iran and others. And what we're seeing today is a level of ferocity on both sides and determination that really is the peak of this conflict over the last century. I don't think the hostages and the Palestinian prisoners, 8,000 of them in Israeli jails, are a lost cause. I think there will be some kind of agreement to exchange them soon, because both sides want that and what comes with it. But whether this leads to a negotiated permanent resolution of the conflict remains to be seen, and that's what we should all aim for.
Guy, in our ahistorical media world, particularly often in the United States, we talk about this beginning on October 7th, but as Rami just reminded us, the roots go back centuries.
Right, but if you look at it through the Israeli angle, this is the making of a decade and a half, a period in which Israelis were told that we would be able to maintain a stable status quo with Hamas, and the whole thing just blew up and embarrassed the prime minister and the current coalition. This is very much was the Netanyahu doctrine that collapsed on the 7th of October. And I think perhaps that's the reason why the situation currently is at an impasse. It is tragic and it is protracted, all three of us. It's not clear when this conflict would end, because it seems that there are reasons why this conflict is being prolonged in an active manner by the Israeli government beyond the point of military reason. Currently, what's on the news is the Israeli military operation in Rafah, which is maybe the most dangerous stage of the conflict, because about 1 million Palestinians are concentrated there because they were pushed by the Israeli army towards the Egyptian-Israeli border. And any military action that Israel takes puts in danger hundreds of thousands of lives. Now, the question remains why Israel didn't start with Rafah. It would have been a logical starting point for Israel to cut short the link between Gaza and Egypt to block the tunnels that go underground and allow Hamas to smuggle such huge quantities of cement and weapons and electronic equipment into the Gaza Strip and basically end there. But what the government is saying is it wants to continue the war for, today, the National Security Advisor of Netanyahu said to the public that the war would continue for another 7 months until the full dismantling of all Hamas infrastructure in the Gaza Strip. And what many Israelis are starting to wonder is whether the government is interested in ever ending the conflict, because what the government may fear, what this coalition may fear, is that once the war stops, people would start to discuss the failure of the Netanyahu doctrine and what comes next.
There's so much to unpack there. What seems to be missing from the so-called Netanyahu doctrine is any real vision for an endgame. And that's what you describe now, that Israeli citizens may be turning on to. Rami, your thoughts on this notion that you can fight your way out of a situation like this, kill every enemy, destroy all infrastructure, and end it that way?
Clearly, that can't be done. Both the United States and Israel, who are really one party together in this conflict against Hamas and their supporters, both in Palestine and around the region. The real tragedy is that the US and Israel have not learned from the last 50, 60 years of history, which I've lived through. I remember the 1960s in college in the US in the 70s, the Vietnam War. And both in Vietnam and Afghanistan, where the US had tremendous military power and used it ruthlessly, they had to eventually pull out and negotiate with the Viet Cong and with the Taliban. And the Israelis similarly have tried over the years in Lebanon with Hezbollah, with Hamas before. They tried all kinds of things in Lebanon. They had the Southern Lebanese Army. They tried to create village leagues in the West Bank. They tried every trick in the book to maintain a dominance in the region that included their control of neighboring Palestinian or Lebanese land. And it just wouldn't work. It doesn't work, not because it's a bad strategy politically, because it runs against human nature. People who are occupied and subjugated and humiliated and killed and go through stuff like we saw yesterday in Rafah, they will rise and fight back till the next 10 generations. And this is exactly what's happened. So no, you can't fight your way out of this. This is a political conflict. It has to be resolved through political means. It's really hard to do that now, but it's never impossible, because at some point we're going to have better leaders in Israel and Palestine and in the US, and better leadership is what you need. We learned from Northern Ireland and South Africa that good leadership is critical to make that transition into a permanent and just peace arrangement.
Guy, what insights can you provide? And I don't expect you to be a spokesperson for all Israeli citizens, right? But what insights can you provide in terms of the public mood, support for Netanyahu, support for the war effort? What's happening?
So, there's some data we can use and we know about, which is the poll numbers of the various parties in Israel. So what you can see is that after the announcement about the judicial coup, as it became known, or judicial reform in January 23, the Netanyahu coalition lost about 10 seats. It lost its majority in public opinion polls. And since 7 October, it lost another 10 seats. So if snap elections would have happened today, the Netanyahu coalition would lose, with his own party, the Likud, losing as much as half of the seats it controls today in the Israeli parliament. So, and I think that with time, there's greater and greater dissatisfaction, as well as demoralization of the Israeli public. There were a lot of lofty promises made in the beginning of this war about what it would bring about, would be the end point. And as the war continues, it becomes clearer and clearer to more Israelis. I'd like to say, by the way, that I had a sense from the start that none of the goals declared by the government would be achieved. After a few days after 7 October, it was clear to me that they will not be able to change the world with tanks or change the situation in Gaza with tanks, which is what the Israeli army is trying to do right now. But more and more Israelis understand that actually the war doesn't lead to the release of the hostages. In fact, we know that the Israeli military bombings in Gaza killed quite a few of these hostages, and every 2 or 3 days, we Israelis, we're announced in the media that more hostages have just died. And each time the announcement said, actually, they died on the 7th of October. We just found out. And people are starting to wonder, did they really die on the 7th of October? Or is this just a figure of speech right now? So, as far as Netanyahu is concerned, he seems to be content to continue the war for the foreseeable future. And then there are other wars, the confrontation with Hezbollah in the north. The West Bank is boiling, which is another issue that we can talk about. He can continue the war indefinitely, but public support for the government is fracturing. Even among his ardent supporters, there's a feeling of disaffection.
Yeah. I want to ask both of you about international pressure. We can look as recently as Afghanistan to see how the U.S. learns that there are limits to your external influences within a country, even in that case with direct military intervention. The pressure we've seen here has been other. For instance, the implications of Spain, Ireland, and Norway, formerly recognizing a Palestinian state. Today, I know that Rami had not seen this because he had just logged in, and I know you're coming from class, Guy, but President Erdogan today had some really harsh words for Netanyahu and for Israel and for the U.S., calling Netanyahu a psychopath, a vampire that feeds on blood. He said that the Islamic world should take collective action and that Israel is not just a threat to Gaza, but to all humanity. And he goes on to say that America has blood on its hands for enabling genocide. So this is just one extreme example of the types of pressure we've seen internationally. And I'm wondering both of your thoughts is this hasn't seemed to move the Netanyahu needle. He seems impervious to any of this outside pressure, maybe even defiant in its face, somehow empowered by it. What are your thoughts on what the international community can do to bring this to some sort of diplomatic end?
Yeah. Erdogan, we should say, has a lever. He has leverage over Israel in two important ways. Erdogan controls about 20% of Israel's oil imports. He can cut them short. Israel imports about 20% of its oil consumption from Azerbaijan through a Turkish port called Ceyhan. So Erdogan can shut it off. I mean, there are bad implications for Turkey as well, because then it seems like an unstable or unloyal trade partner, and other countries would wonder about that. But that's one leverage. And the other he already used. Turkey is Israel's 5th largest trade partner, and Erdogan has already shut down trade with Israel. Inflation is rising on account of the closing of the Red Sea Straits and cutting down trade ties with Turkey. And I don't know what would be the point in which the Israeli public would turn more decisively against the government. I think one way to think about the Netanyahu government is unpopular in Israel, but is not illegitimate. I think that's an important distinction. So people would still go to the army and serve and fight in the war, although they do not support the government. But at some point there'll be a breaking point. We just don't know what it is. My impression is that international pressure would only increase in the coming weeks and months.
Rami, your thoughts on this question of international intervention or pressure?
Yeah, I think both Hamas and the Israeli government have developed some really strong self-reliance mechanisms, and they're showing them. And they also depend heavily on basically one partner. For Israel, the U.S. is really all that counts. Everybody else counts, but the U.S. counts really more than everybody. And as long as the U.S. continues to support Israel militarily, financially, which is not the biggest thing, but it helps, and diplomatic support at the UN, shielding Israel internationally, as long as that's still there, and it still is, then Israel feels, probably Netanyahu's government feel, they can go on. They don't care about anything else. They've shown that international law, UN treaties, UN resolutions, norms of civilized states expressed in human rights and things like that are totally irrelevant for Israel right now. They may come back one day, but right now they're not. So international pressure is not going to have an immediate impact because Israel can keep going as long as the U.S. is doing what it's doing. And that may or may not change. We'll have to see. Hamas, similarly, is very powerful, but it relies on external partners for various things. It relies on Hezbollah, on Iran, on the Qataris as a diplomatic outlet, the Egyptians as a diplomatic outlet. So they are susceptible to pressure, and they've held out for almost 8 months, which is pretty surprising to most people. So the pressure will, in the end, concerted international pressure will make a big difference. And I believe that serious people who are working now on this should look at a package where you bring it on a ceasefire, you exchange the hostages and the prisoners, you allow normal movement within Gaza, you get the Israelis back to the border, but international coalitions have to step in with serious security guarantees for both sides, and a serious mechanism to, down the road, not now because anger is too high, but down the road to start exploring a political negotiation like the Madrid process, which happened in the early 1990, I think 92 or whatever it was. So international pressure is both important to stop the fighting, but also to permanently stop it by moving on to a political negotiation that could possibly resolve it for both sides equitably, which I think it can, but it's going to take more work now than it would have taken 10 or 15 years ago.
Any solution to the current conflict or to the ongoing issues between these players is going to take time, right? It's not going to happen overnight, even though there may be hope. But right now, there are people in need of food, in need of shelter, in need of security. What can you tell us about the current humanitarian aid situation? I know that the U.S. Temporary port has run into some problems based on bad weather. Are we anywhere close to getting people what they need?
The Israeli response to international outcry over the humanitarian situation in Gaza has been mixed at best. There are some elements in the government and in the Israeli military that do understand that humanitarian catastrophe, starvation in Gaza would be bad for Israel in all sorts of ways. And they do try to let trucks in, not just from one crossing, but from several crossings inside Gaza, where actually the humanitarian situation is worse in the north of Gaza, not in Rafah, in terms of food. That's what the problem is. But at the same time, there are elements in the government, and this is the party that represents Jewish settlers in the West Bank, religious Zionism, as well as the settlers themselves that try to do everything they can to block the trucks and even to destroy by themselves food shipments. We saw several pictures of them doing that. There's a peace movement, an Israeli peace movement, standing together that now stands in the Tarkumia crossing in the West Bank. It's a major avenue for food aid from Jordan to reach Gaza. So they basically defend with their bodies the trucks. And so far, in the last few days, they were successful in allowing the trucks to pass through.
Rami, any thoughts on the humanitarian aid situation?
Yeah, I think it's a really tough one, because if you judge it just by the evidence of how people have acted, not what they've said, but what they've done, it's pretty convincing that the Israeli government, not all Israeli people, and the American government, not all American people, don't care about the humanitarian condition of the Palestinians. They've allowed this war to go on for almost 8 months. The US has been there with the funding and the arms and the diplomatic protection, and the government in Israel is doing what it wants to do. The humanitarian needs of the Palestinians don't really matter to the US and the Israeli governments. They matter to a lot of other people around the world, and the pressure is building, but we've seen very clearly that Israel defies international norms, and Netanyahu boasts about this. And this is part of his strongman image, that we will protect ourselves, we'll fight alone if we have to. And most people will say that if they're attacked. But the humanitarian issue really is, unfortunately, pretty secondary right now. And here I live in the US, and I watch the media coverage of the mainstream media and of the government's statements. It's really quite sad that the US government acts in such a inhuman way. And this is one of the great challenges, which is for political scientists and psychologists and others to figure out, why do you have an American leadership in the Congress and the executive branch, which is pretty much followed by the mainstream media broadly? Why does this group of people actively participate in what the world has called clearly a genocide? This is very un-American. I mean, the Americans have done their own genocides and their own atrocities all over the world, but to explicitly support this while it's visible to everybody on social media is quite a puzzle. So the nature of the link between the Israeli government and the US government is something that really deserves a lot of study. So, Guy, maybe you can get some of your PhD students to work on this from the Israeli side, and then people here will work on it here, and because it's really critical to understand that.
Guy, at the heart of what we're talking about now is, it's sort of this notion that, look, after the type of attack that Israel endured on October 7th, no nation would be denied its right to respond. The question is where you reach that point where you cross over from what is deemed to be a reasonable response into something else. And that seems to be where the debate is now, in terms of whether there is concern for humanitarian needs or not. What can you tell us about the discussion within Israel about this question?
Well, you know, what happened on 7th of October was so devastating, and for millions of people in Israel, so scary. I mean, it's hard for me to explain how panicked the public was in the first few weeks after that happened, including very, intelligent, broad-minded people who are my neighbors, who could say that they were just terrified of Arabs in general. I mean, the panic was palpable in Israel at the time. I thought that the land invasion would be the wrong thing to do. I'd say I was in the absolute minority. There were a few voices at the time, but no one was willing to listen to them. I think the question, I mean, it would be hard for me to argue against the claim that Israel's response is excessive. But I think some of the discussion is like, how do you shape a military operation in a way that would achieve the goals that you are talking about? Okay, so going into Gaza to a military campaign that Hamas was well prepared for and envisaged how it would come about would be a tragic mistake. American generals came to Israel at the time, said, learn from our mistakes, from our wars in Iraq and in Afghanistan, getting into urban warfare in densely populated areas would be a huge mistake. It would be a quagmire. And the Israeli cabinet, but I think also Israeli generals didn't want to listen. So I think the question is like, why does Israel continues to fight? What it hopes to achieve out of the current military operation that it's doing, and for a bigger and bigger number of people in Israel, it turns out that there are no clear goals other than destruction of Hamas infrastructure, destruction of military equipment, but it's not clear when it ends. The Economist, even before the Israeli operation started, said, probably 500 kilometers of tunnels in Gaza. That would take months. Now the Israeli army say it's not 500, it's 750 kilometers of tunnels. It's not like if your goal is to destroy any Hamas infrastructure in Gaza, it will never end. It will never end. So I think it's not just excessive in terms. I mean, the question is whether the military operation can achieve its stated goals. And I think with each passing day, it turns out that it cannot.
Rami, I want to ask you about this, and then Guy, come back to you on the same question. And it's the notion of the wider war, right? From the very start, concerns were expressed globally and certainly within the region that they didn't want this thing to spill over into a regional war. Some people would say, listen, that train already left the station, and maybe it's not a direct war, it's a shadow war, but it's been ongoing. I want to get your thoughts, both of your thoughts, on this question of the wider war and what the risks are for escalation in that regard. Rami.
This is an important point, but it remains subordinate to the core issue, which is the contest, the century-old contest between Zionism and Palestinian Arabism, which has grown into a conflict between the state of Israel and many surrounding Arab states and Iran. So we need to constantly go back to the core conflict and then look at the spread. The regional situation is incredibly important because what you have now, we've seen in the last 30 years, the incompetence of Arab governments to deal with Israel militarily or otherwise. Some of them have made a peace agreement and reached peace, which I'm happy about for them, but it hasn't taken away the sense among the vast majority of Arab people that the Palestine issue needs to be resolved equitably. And we've put forward a plan in the Arab peace plan that we think is fair for both sides. But the fascinating thing is the emergence of these Arab, Sunni and Shiite, Arab, Lebanese, Palestinian, Yemeni, Iraqis, all these different militant groups all over the region who have developed greater and greater capabilities, so that the war that Israel wages now is against 5 or 6 different entities in the region, all of whom are following a similar pattern of developing clandestine, serious military capabilities. Israel tried to destroy Hezbollah in Lebanon several times. It couldn't do it. It's trying to destroy Hamas. It probably won't destroy it all, but it will damage it severely. And the spread of the sentiment, anti-Israeli sentiment around the region has been there for decades and decades. The Iranian situation is, to me, the most fascinating, because Iran, under the Shah, had very close relations with Israel. They give them oil and arms and stuff. So the point here is that you have a political conflict, and you will get allies and supporters on both sides to help you. Israel has people around the world who support it, who are not Jewish and who are not Middle Eastern and who are not Zionists. So it's no surprise that you get Arabs and non-Arabs, Turkey, Iran, supporting the Palestinians, but actually supporting a just peace. That this is what we constantly say. We're looking for a resolution that's fair to both sides. We're not looking, as the Israeli propaganda has it, that we're trying to destroy Israel. We want to wipe out the Jews. That's completely untrue. So the regional situation is going to continue to stay hot and may erupt in some exchanges here and there, but I don't see a full-scale war. And clearly the Iranians and the Israelis a few weeks ago sent back and forth messages that we can reach you and we can defend ourselves. So they're not going to get into a regional war, and the U.S. certainly doesn't want to do that.
Guy.
Yeah, it's a regional war, and it's a regional war largely between Israel and an Iranian coalition. I mean, the project of Iran in the previous years was to react to Israeli threats to bomb Iranian nuclear installations by creating what the Iranians called a ring of fire around Israel, and hence Iranian help and support to various militias that have their own interests, but are also united in, condemning Israeli policies or acting against Israel. The most important of which is Hezbollah, but Hamas also got aid, support, and military training from Iran. The same is true for the Houthis. So I think the big question that, a different government, if we had a different government in Jerusalem right now, is does it make sense to fight against various allies of Iran rather than wage a shadow war against Iran itself? Instead of Israel attiring itself in an endless fight with Hamas and Hezbollah, it has little chance to hurt them in a way that these organizations or militias would stop fighting it. Whether or not, like, the main problem is the Ayatollah regime in Iran, and then you can, or you should, do some tactical concessions in order to end this conflict and develop a new strategy.
Gentlemen, thank you. We are very short on time, but I want to give each of you about a minute for any final thoughts. And rather than me direct that with a direct question, let's just leave it open-ended. What hasn't been said yet today that you'd like to say? Rami, you go first, and then we'll give Guy the final word.
I would say that given the century-long nature of this conflict, I would say that a critical goal is not just to have a ceasefire, exchange prisoners, hostages, etc. The critical goal for everybody, especially for the Israelis, is to define Zionism, geographically and politically. So Zionism is a beautiful thing for Jews, especially in Russia in 1890 when this process started. But when it became part of a British imperial project, it became a colonial project, settler colonialism and apartheid and all the terrible things that have been said about Israel recently, which are based in fact for most people and leading to genocide. Zionism has to be defined. The Arabs have said we are willing to live with a Jewish majority state in its 67 borders if we resolve these issues. So this is, I don't know if when Guy said tactical concessions, I don't know if he meant that or something else, but both sides have to make concessions to the other so that Palestinian rights can be achieved, statehood and sovereignty. The refugee issue has to be resolved equitably, and Israel similarly has to get the sense that it can live in peace and normal relations, but only when it stops being a settler colonial apartheid state.
Thanks. Guy Laron.
So to continue what Rami said, like the elephant in the room, the topic we haven't discussed, but it is major, is the Israeli settlements in the West Bank. This government is about keeping them at all costs, and that's why the judicial reform was about constitutional amendments that would allow the government to annex the West Bank, and it keeps on fighting because it fears that any end to this war would start talks about a settlement that would include dismantling some of the Israeli settlements in the West Bank. So that's the biggest obstacle right now. And Rami talked about redefining Zionism. So the question for the Israeli public is what kind of price it is willing to pay for keeping those settlements, and if it is Israel isn't willing, or if the Israeli public isn't willing to pay that price. So how Israel extricate itself from its presence in some of the areas in the West Bank.
Gentlemen, you know that it's been said that you can't solve a problem if you don't think about it clearly. And so thanks to both of you today for helping us think about this clearly. If there's any hope, this is the type of clear-eyed analysis we need. So thank you very much. I should also tell our viewers and listeners, if you'd like more from Rami and Guy and other experts in the region, check out the Middle East program here at the Wilson Center. Marissa Kerma and her team are doing lots of terrific work that also involves these two gentlemen and others. Gentlemen, thanks. We hope we can call on you again. We hope that it will be to talk about, how things are working out under a peace agreement. So let's be hopeful in a time where we need it. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for your time and interest.